December 1980, the port of Galveston, Texas. The cold here is damp, clinging, carried off the Gulf of Mexico. It is a different cold than the dry, biting freeze of a Ukrainian steppe winter, or the thin, piercing chill of the Hindu Kush. Gantry cranes stand like skeletal giants against a grey dawn sky. A ship moves slowly through the channel. Its hull is grey, its superstructure weathered. It flies the flag of the Soviet Union, a bold red banner with its golden hammer, sickle and star. The name is visible on the bow, Komsomolskaya Slava, the glory of the Komsomol. It does not carry tanks or artillery or the sophisticated weapons of a superpower. Its holds are cavernous, empty, waiting. It nudges against the concrete wharf of a massive grain terminal. American longshoremen secure the lines, their breath forming plumes in the air. They watch silently. From the towering elevators, a golden river begins to flow. Wheat, millions of kernels of a hard red winter wheat grown in the heartland of Kansas and Nebraska, cascades down conveyor belts in a continuous, rustling roar. It pours into the open holds of the Soviet freighter, a torrent of sustenance from the world's greatest capitalist adversary. On the bridge, a Soviet trade official watches the grain flow. His assignment is logistical, not political. Yet the symbolism is a physical weight. This golden river is not aid. It is a commercial purchase, paid for in hard currency. Rubles converted to dollars the Soviet state can scarcely afford. Each ton is an admission of failure. Each shipment a quiet, humbling compromise. The war in Afghanistan is 11 months old, and its most critical supply line does not run through the Salang Tunnel, but from the breadbasket of America. To understand the weight of the grain in that freighter's hold, one must first understand the emptiness it was meant to fill. The Soviet Union's agricultural failure was not a sudden crisis of the 1980s. It was a chronic, systemic condition, a foundational crack in the facade of a superpower. It was the product of a 70-year experiment. The Bolshevik vision was one of industrial might. Steel, coal, electricity, and arms would be the measures of progress. Agriculture was to be forcibly collectivized, transformed into a state-run factory of food. The human cost of this transformation, from the Kulak purges to the Holodomor, was catastrophic. The economic result was a permanently inefficient system. By the 1960s, the USSR, sprawled across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, could not reliably feed its own people. Nikita Khrushchev's ambitious, ultimately disastrous Virgin Lands campaign of the 1950s offered a temporary reprieve by ploughing up vast tracts of fragile Kazakh steppe, only to see them turn to dust. By the time Leonid Brezhnev consolidated power, the problem was structural. The Soviet peasant, now a state farm worker, had little incentive to produce. Machinery was poorly maintained. Transport and storage infrastructure was medieval. Up to a third of each harvest would rot in soggy fields or leaky silos before reaching a city. Brezhnev's response was not reform, but a bargain. The state would guarantee stability, employment, and subsidized basics: bread, vodka, rent. In return, the population would offer political quiescence. The cheap, plentiful loaf of bread was not just food. It was the cornerstone of this tacit agreement, a symbol of the state's provision. To fail on bread was to risk social unrest of a scale not seen since the revolutions. Thus, the Kremlin developed a dual-track strategy. Domestically, it poured enormous resources into agriculture, nearly a third of all state investment by the 1970s, with diminishing returns. The other track was external. The Soviet Union became the world's largest grain importer. This created a critical vulnerability. It required vast amounts of hard currency, earned primarily through oil and gas exports, to buy food its ideology claimed it should produce in abundance. The first major shock came in 1972. A series of poor harvests coincided with a secret, massive purchase of American wheat. Soviet trade officials operating through third-party companies bought nearly 20 million tons of grain at subsidized prices, triggering a spike in global food costs that emptied American supermarket shelves. For the Soviets, it was a tactical masterstroke, filling their granaries on the cheap, but it revealed a profound truth. The United States held a leverage they did not: the power to feed the Soviet people. This precarious balance of guns, grain and oil defined the Brezhnev era, a brittle equilibrium that would shatter the moment the Politburo looked beyond its own borders for a military solution. The decision to invade Afghanistan in December 1979 was not taken lightly. It was, in the sterile calculus of the Politburo, a defensive move. The The sour revolution of 1978 had brought a fractious, hardline Marxist regime to power in Kabul. By 1979, it was teetering on collapse, facing a nationwide insurgency. Hafizullah Amin, the Afghan leader, was seen in Moscow as reckless, unstable, and potentially open to flirting with the West. The fear was not of conquest, but of loss. The loss of a buffer state, a domino falling on the Soviet Union's soft southern underbelly. The military operation itself, Shrom 79, Storm 79, was a swift, brutal masterpiece of conventional power. On December 24th, the airlift began. For 48 hours, a continuous stream of An-22 and An-12 transport aircraft darkened the sky over the Amu Darya River. They disgorged elements of the 105th Guards Airborne Division directly onto the tarmac at Kabul International Airport. Simultaneously, the 40th Army's motorized rifle divisions, some 80,000 men strong, rumbled across the pontoon bridges at Termez and Kushka. Their objectives were clear: secure key cities, highways, and infrastructure. The palace assault on December the 27th was executed with cold precision by KGB Zenit and Grom operatives and paratroopers. Hafizullah Amin was killed. By New Year's Day, Babrak Karmal, Moscow's hand-picked successor, was installed. The Soviet military had, on paper, achieved every objective, but the invasion was a geopolitical earthquake. Overnight, it unified a fragmented global opposition. President Jimmy Carter, stunned by the move, shifted policy dramatically. Would use military force to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf. More consequentially, he authorized covert action. In early 1980, he signed a presidential finding that began funneling weapons and money through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, to the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. This trickle would, in years to come, become a flood. For the Soviet Union, the war immediately began to metastasize from a brief intervention into a grinding, open-ended conflict. The Mujahideen, operating in small, mobile groups, refused to engage in set-piece battles. They mined roads, ambushed convoys, and then melted back into a sympathetic population or the maze of mountains. The 40th Army found itself holding cities and roads, while the countryside belonged to the night. The conflict demanded a constant, enormous supply of materiel: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, all of which had to be hauled over 1,500 miles of vulnerable highway from the Soviet railhead at Termez through the Salang Pass. The economic calculus of December 1979 had been fatally flawed. The Politburo had weighed the cost of a short, sharp operation. They had not budgeted for a forever war. And this new, voracious drain on Soviet resources, financial, industrial, and human, intersected catastrophically with the system's oldest, deepest weakness. The war machine and the breadbasket were now in direct, unsustainable competition. Every ruble spent on Hind helicopter parts was a ruble not spent on fertilizer or combine harvesters. Every train car carrying shells south was a train car not moving grain north. The Afghan quagmire did not create the Soviet grain crisis. It turned a chronic condition into a terminal hemorrhage. The stage was now set. On one side, an empire stretched thin, fighting a war it could not win and feeding a population it could not afford to starve. On the other, an adversary that saw not just a battlefield, but a fundamental economic vulnerability ready to be exploited. The war was fought in two theatres: the mountains of Afghanistan and the cities of the Soviet Union. For the young conscript of the 40th Army, food was a central, tangible element of his reality. He relied on the sukhoi, the dry ration, or, if stationed at a remote outpost, tins of tushonka, stewed meat, hard biscuits, and condensed milk. Supply convoys were lifelines, and their ambush meant not just a tactical defeat, but hunger. In letters home, soldiers often wrote not of combat, but of the quality of bread, the longing for fresh vegetables, the prized jars of jam sent from home. The state, at great cost, ensured its fighting men were fed, a logistical feat that strained the very system it was meant to defend. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Leningrad, or Kiev, his mother stood in a different line: the bread queue. By the early 1980s, shortages of meat, dairy, and fresh produce were endemic. Yet the quality often suffered. The bread could be grey, dense, stale. The act of queuing, of dostat, procuring, through persistence and luck, was a daily ritual of quiet frustration. Propaganda from Pravda and the evening news spoke of international solidarity, of the heroic internationalist duty in Afghanistan, and of record harvests on the collective farms. The reality on the ground, The empty dairy counter, the poor quality sausage, the endless wait told a different story. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. The state projected the image of a superpower feeding a revolution, while its own citizens could not reliably feed their families. The soldier, eating his tushonka in the dust of Logar, was in a cruel irony, often better provisioned than the civilian he had left behind. The Soviet Union's industrial might was channeled through the prism of the military-industrial complex, the VPK. It could produce world-class T-72 tanks, AK-74 rifles, and MiG-29 jets in stunning numbers. Its space program rivaled NASA. This was the empire of the guns side of the classic economic equation. The butter, however, was produced by a separate, neglected, and hopelessly inefficient civilian sector. Nowhere was this dichotomy more stark than in agriculture. Soviet farm machinery was a byword for poor quality and breakdown. The mighty Kirovets tractor was powerful but crude, guzzling fuel and requiring constant repair. Grain combines like the Don 1500 were unreliable. A significant portion of the harvest was lost because they simply broke down in the field. Spare parts were perpetually scarce. The fertilizer industry, though massive, produced inefficiently and polluted catastrophically. The entire agro-industrial complex was a net drain, consuming more value than it produced. The war in Afghanistan exacerbated this to a breaking point. The VPK had priority on everything: high-quality steel, precision electronics, skilled engineers, rubber, fuel, and transport. The Ministry of Agriculture did not. As the 40th Army's demands grew, the resources available to modernize farms, build efficient grain elevators, or produce reliable trucks for rural areas shrank. Furthermore, the human cost of the war removed tens of thousands of young men from the workforce annually, potential mechanics, engineers, and skilled laborers who might have bolstered the civilian economy. The state was forced to choose daily between funding the production of one more BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle or 100 more grain combines. In a war of attrition, the BMP always won, but a nation cannot eat steel. The very technological prowess that sustained the war effort was systematically starving the homeland that supported it. This internal competition for resources set the stage for a desperate external solution, one that would shift the war's front lines from the Hindu Kush to the negotiating tables of international grain markets. The Soviet leadership from 1979 onward was a pantheon of the old and infirm. Leonid Brezhnev, in power since 1964, was by the time of the invasion a frail figure, slurring his words, reliant on stimulants, and increasingly detached from reality. He was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who, though more intellectually vigorous, was dying of kidney failure. Konstantin Chernenko, who followed, was a Brezhnev loyalist in such poor health he could barely deliver a speech. This gerontocracy presided over the Afghan war and the grain crisis. Their worldview was forged in the crucibles of the Great Patriotic War and the Stalinist industrial transformation. They understood power in terms of military parity, ideological rigidity, and control. The idea of systemic economic failure was alien. Temporary shortcomings and difficulties could be solved by exhortation, discipline, or if necessary, by purchasing from the enemy. The Afghan decision reflected this mindset. A problem of political control on their border required a military solution. The subsequent grain purchases were seen not as a humiliating dependency, but as a shrewd, temporary tactical acquisition from the global market, using capitalist tools to sustain the socialist project. Yet their physical and intellectual sclerosis prevented them from grasping the synergistic catastrophe they had unleashed. The war was not a discrete event. It was a hemorrhage sapping the patient's strength just as a terminal illness took hold. In Politburo meetings, the discussion of grain imports and the discussion of helicopter sorties were often separate agenda items managed by different bureaucracies, the Foreign Trade Ministry and the Defense Ministry. The connective tissue, the fact that one was bankrupting the other, was a systemic truth too vast and too damning for the aging leadership to confront. They managed symptoms, not the disease. Their solution to every problem was more control, more secrecy, more expenditure of dwindling resources, deepening the very vulnerabilities they sought to mask. While the Soviet leadership viewed their problems in compartments, their adversaries saw the connections with crystal clarity. In Langley, Virginia, analysts at the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Soviet Analysis, SOVA, had long identified agriculture as the USSR's Achilles heel. Satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and reports from diplomatic and trade channels provided a detailed picture of Soviet harvest yields, storage capacity, and transport bottlenecks. The CIA didn't just know the Soviets needed grain, they could estimate with remarkable accuracy how much, when, and at what financial cost. This intelligence became a strategic weapon. The Carter and, more aggressively, the Reagan administrations adopted a policy of economic warfare. The goal was not simply to arm the Mujahideen, but to impose crippling costs on the Soviet system from multiple angles. The grain lever was a key part of this. In 1980, following the invasion, President Carter imposed a partial grain embargo. While it caused short-term hardship for American farmers and was later relaxed, it sent a shockwave through Moscow. It demonstrated that the food supply could be weaponized. The most devastating blow, however, came from an allied front, the oil price. Here, the United States forged a quiet, powerful alliance with Saudi Arabia. In the early 1980s, the Saudis, holders of vast spare oil production capacity, dramatically increased output. The global price of oil, which had been high throughout the 1970s, collapsed by 1984 to 85. For the Soviet Union, this was a double catastrophe. Oil and gas exports were its primary source of hard currency, the very currency needed to buy grain and fund the war. As the price plummeted, Soviet export revenues nosedived. Simultaneously, the cost of the Afghan war skyrocketed. The math became impossible. The CIA had helped orchestrate a perfect trap. The war drained rubles, while the oil crash strangled the dollar income. The only remaining move was to go, cap in hand, to the very grain traders they had sought to outmaneuver a decade before, now from a position of profound weakness. The confluence of these angles, human discontent, industrial failure, sclerotic leadership, and targeted geopolitical pressure, created a tension that could only be resolved by a single, defining, and humiliating act. The years 1984 and 1985 formed the convergence point, the perfect storm. In Afghanistan, the war entered its most brutal, industrialized phase. General Mikhail Zaitsev, commander of the 40th Army, unleashed a doctrine of overwhelming firepower and relentless aerial bombardment to break the Mujahideen. Sortie rates for helicopters and jets hit unprecedented levels. Entire valleys were depopulated. The financial cost was staggering, burning through the defense budget like a fuse. Simultaneously, nature delivered a series of devastating blows to the Soviet heartland. A succession of poor growing seasons marked by drought, early frosts, and the long-term ecological consequences of the over-farmed virgin lands resulted in catastrophic harvest failures. The 1984 harvest was a disaster. Estimates suggest a shortfall of nearly 50 million tons against state targets. The granaries meant to hold strategic reserves were emptying. Rumour of potential rationing began to circulate in major cities, sparking low-level panic buying and longer queues. It was at this precise moment of maximum vulnerability that the geopolitical screws were tightened. The Reagan administration, now fully committed to rolling back the evil empire, wielded economic tools with precision. The 1980 grain embargo had been a blunt instrument, but by 1983-84, the strategy evolved. High-level diplomatic and trade negotiations explicitly linked grain sales to Soviet behavior on other fronts: human rights, arms control, and the war in Afghanistan. The message was clear: your food security is now a bargaining chip in a global confrontation you are losing. The most crippling pressure, however, was financial. Saudi understanding on oil production reached its full, devastating effect. In 1985, Saudi Arabia abandoned its role as swing producer and flooded the market. The price of oil, which had been over $30 a barrel in 1983, collapsed to around $10 by mid-1986. For the Soviet Union, the impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. Analysts estimate the USSR lost between £10 and $20 billion in annual hard currency earnings, a blow equivalent to multiple percentage points of its entire GDP. The treasury was being bled dry from two wounds: the endless, expensive war in Afghanistan and the collapse of its primary source of foreign income. Inside the Politburo, the atmosphere shifted from concern to crisis. The old certainties frayed. The reports from the Committee for State Security, KGB, tasked with monitoring domestic morale, grew increasingly alarming. They spoke not of political dissent, but of a more dangerous phenomenon: widespread grumbling about food, a loss of faith in the state's basic function. The war, once sold as a short, victorious campaign, was now a hated, endless drain, and the state could no longer keep its most fundamental promise. The daily bread, the social contract, was breaking. Faced with this tripartite crisis, military quagmire, agricultural collapse, and financial hemorrhage, the Soviet leadership confronted a choice between ideological purity and social stability. The decision, when it came, was made not in the spirit of strategy, but of sheer survival. The decision unfolded not in a single dramatic meeting, but in a series of grim, secretive deliberations through 1985 and into 1986. The protagonists were the new generation of Soviet leadership, albeit one still emerging from the shadow of the gerontocracy. Konstantin Chernenko's death in March 1985 brought Mikhail Gorbachev to power. Gorbachev, a relative outsider from Stavropol, an agricultural region, understood the farm crisis intimately. He came to office promising uskoreniya, acceleration, and perestroika, restructuring. But first he had to stave off immediate collapse. The Politburo debates were shielded from public view, but the calculus was starkly evident in the numbers presented by Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, and the Ministry of Foreign Trade. The figures showed an impossible equation. Domestic grain production could not meet demand. The strategic reserve was nearing critical levels. Hard currency reserves, already depleted by the oil crash, were insufficient to cover both the necessary grain imports and the ongoing import of Western machine tools and technology needed for industrial modernization. And the war in Afghanistan consumed an estimated 3 to 4 billion rubles annually, a sum that in hard currency terms could have purchased millions of tons of grain. The humiliation was not in needing to buy grain, but in the terms now dictated. The leverage of 1972 was gone. The United States, through its grain trading conglomerates and with full backing of the Department of Agriculture, held all the cards. Negotiations were no longer about discrete third-party purchases. They were state-to-state, and they were public. In the summer of 1985, the Soviet Union was forced to signal its intent to purchase massive quantities, ultimately agreeing to buy a guaranteed minimum of 9 million tons of American wheat and corn annually under a new long-term grain agreement. The signing was a formal acknowledgement of a permanent dependency. The timing was a masterpiece of geopolitical irony. Even as the ink dried on the grain agreements in 1986, Gorbachev was authorizing a dramatic escalation of the war in Afghanistan. The 40th Army launched massive offensives in the eastern provinces and intensified the bombing campaign, hoping for a decisive military solution before the economic situation became terminal. The two policies, military escalation and economic capitulation, were now running on parallel, contradictory tracks. The Soviet state was, in effect, writing a multi-billion-dollar check to its primary adversary to feed its people, while writing another check to fund the destruction of its soldiers in a war that adversary was fueling. The moment of true humiliation was not a battle lost, but a signature on a trade document. It was the sound of American wheat pouring into the holds of Soviet ships, a sound that drowned out the propaganda of self-sufficiency. It was the sight of Politburo members approving the diversion of precious hard currency from the military-industrial complex to Cargill and Continental Grain. The turning point was this. The Soviet Union had been forced to monetize its superpower status, trading geopolitical leverage and strategic reserves for the most basic commodity of national existence. The war was no longer just bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding the state of its autonomy, its ideology, and its pride with every ship that sailed from Galveston. The floodgates were now open. The grain deal was not a solution, but an admission. It stabilized the breadlines temporarily, but it unleashed a cascade of consequences that would ultimately sweep the entire system away. The immediate consequences of the grain dependency were both economic and psychological. A river of hard currency, billions of dollars annually, now flowed westward to American grain companies and Canadian, Australian, and European suppliers. This capital flight directly cannibalized Gorbachev's plans for perestroika. Funds earmarked for modernizing Soviet industry, for importing advanced technology, for improving consumer goods, were instead spent on basic sustenance. The Soviet economy was trapped in a cycle of stagnation. It could not grow because it was spending its seed capital on bread. Domestically, the state propaganda machine faced an insoluble problem. It could not acknowledge the scale of the imports, for that would shatter the myth of socialist agricultural superiority. But the population was not blind. The contrast between the newsreels of endless collective farm harvests and the reality of empty shelves bred a deep, corrosive cynicism. The term deficit, deficit, became a defining feature of daily life, encompassing not just goods, but faith in the system itself. For the veterans of the Afghan War, the Afghansi, returning to this deteriorating homeland, the disillusionment was profound. They had fought a brutal, confusing war for a state that now seemed incapable of providing the most basic elements of the life it had promised. Many returned to find their sacrifices met with public indifference or even hostility, their status as internationalist warriors an empty, state-sponsored slogan. The social contract had been broken with them twice, first by sending them to a futile war, and second by failing to provide the prosperous, stable society they were supposedly defending. This generation of young men, hardened by combat and alienated by their reception, would become a significant source of social unrest and a potent symbol of state failure in the years to come. There was no famine in the classic sense. The grain imports prevented outright starvation. But the fear itself was a political weapon of immense power. It revealed a complete lack of public confidence in the state's ability to manage its most fundamental duty. When the Chernobyl disaster erupted in April 1986, the state's instinct for secrecy and mismanagement was confirmed in the most terrifying way possible, further eroding trust. The system was now seen as not only inefficient, but dangerously incompetent. The grain purchases had purchased time, but they had also financed the exposure of the regime's fatal flaws. Every imported ton was a receipt for failure, a physical testament to an ideology that could not feed its own people. The next phase would be the desperate and ultimately futile attempt to reform a system whose foundations had already been sold overseas. Gorbachev's reforms of perestroika and glasnost were in part a direct response to the economic stranglehold revealed by the grain crisis. The humiliating dependency on American wheat was a glaring symptom of a diseased system. To break the cycle, Gorbachev needed to radically overhaul Soviet agriculture and industry to generate export-worthy goods, not just raw materials. But the reforms, unleashed into a system already brittle from decades of stagnation and the drain of Afghanistan, accelerated the collapse rather than preventing it. Glasnost, openness, allowed the long-simmering public discontent over shortages to find a voice. For the first time, newspapers began to publish critical reports on the agricultural disaster. The scale of the imports, the rotting harvests, the billions spent, these were no longer state secrets but topics of public outrage. The veil was lifted and the sight was one of profound waste and mismanagement. The legitimacy of the entire communist project was questioned on the grounds of its most basic failure. It could not competently manage the production and distribution of food. Meanwhile, the financial toll became unsustainable. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union's hard currency debt had ballooned, much of it owed for grain and other agricultural products. The state was caught in a credit trap. To service its debts and continue imports, it needed to export more oil and gas. But global prices remained low. It needed to export manufactured goods, but its industries produced nothing the West wanted. The Afghan War formally ended with the withdrawal in 1989, but its financial legacy was a mountain of debt and a gutted treasury. The final, symbolic collapse of the food system came in 1990-91. With the economy in freefall, republics beginning to assert sovereignty, and the distribution chains breaking down, even the imported grain could not reliably reach cities. The Soviet Union, once a net exporter of grain under the Tsars, now saw breadlines return with a vengeance, this time for bread made from foreign wheat. In a cruel twist, the grain that had been purchased to maintain stability became a symbol of the state's total bankruptcy. The 1990 harvest was again poor, and the state, now virtually bankrupt, could not afford to make up the difference. The rationing that had been feared for a decade finally began in major cities. The chain of causality was now complete. The Afghan war had exacerbated a chronic agricultural weakness into an acute financial and political crisis. The need to buy grain humiliated the leadership, drained the economy, and exposed the system's lies to its own people. It directly fueled the public anger and sense of betrayal that glasnost unleashed. By the time the coup plotters moved against Gorbachev in August 1991, the Soviet state had already forfeited its claim to superpower status, not on a battlefield, but in the global commodity markets and in the empty shelves of its own stores. The economic defeat preceded the political one. The Soviet Union did not fall because it lost a war in Afghanistan. It fell because it had to buy the bread to fight it. The aftermath was not a new order, but the liquidation of an empire that had run out of credit, both financial and moral. The story of Soviet grain is a story of inverted power. For decades, the world measured Soviet strength in intercontinental ballistic missiles, in tank divisions parading through Red Square, in the relentless expansion of its ideological sphere. It was an empire built on iron, will, and fear. Yet beneath that hardened shell, the foundation was soft, fertile, and perpetually failing. The ultimate contradiction of the late Soviet state was that it could put a man in space but could not reliably put bread on the table of its citizens without the help of its arch-rival. The war in Afghanistan acted not as the cause of collapse but as the catalyst that exposed this fatal paradox. It forced a stark choice between guns and grain, between imperial ambition and domestic necessity. In choosing both, by fighting an unwinnable war while buying grain from America, the leadership revealed a truth more damaging than any battlefield defeat. The superpower was a supplicant. Its autonomy, the very core of its ideological claim, was negotiable, traded for hard currency and basic sustenance. This was a humiliation that could not be masked by propaganda or military parades. It seeped into the public consciousness, eroding faith not in a policy, but in the entire premise of the system. The legacy of this chapter is a lesson in the nature of power. True power in the modern world is not merely destructive capacity. It is resilience, adaptability, and economic integrity. The United States, by wielding its agricultural surplus and financial leverage, demonstrated a form of strength far more sophisticated and ultimately more decisive than any direct military confrontation. It won a critical battle in the Cold War, not with missiles pointed at Moscow, but with wheat unloaded in Odessa and Riga. In the end, the Soviet-Afghan War is remembered for the images of burnt-out tanks and weary soldiers. But its deepest, most enduring wound was inflicted far from the Hindu Kush. It was the quiet, relentless drain of grain-filled freighters crossing the Atlantic, each one carrying not just sustenance for a population, but the unmovable weight of a superpower's failure. The final collapse in 1991 was political and dramatic, but the real end had come years earlier, with the signing of a grain agreement, the moment an empire tacitly admitted it could no longer feed itself.